The man walked into water deep enough to drown a horse. He never resurfaced. I have carried that picture in my head for 40 years now, and I will carry it into whatever grave they dig for me. It was the last week of October in 1887, the kind of evening when the light goes out of the Highlands all at once, like a lamp blown out by a child. I was bringing my flock down off the upper slope above Loch Dearg, and the mist had already settled low across the water the way it always did in that valley, thick and slow, moving against the wind instead of with it. That should have been my first warning. The mist there never behaved as mist ought to behave. I saw Angus MC Loud standing at the shoreline. He had his crook in his right hand and his cap in his left, and he was bareheaded in the cold, which was strange because Angus was not a man who took his cap off for anything short of a church door. He stood very still. I watched him for the better part of a minute before I called out to him, and he did not turn. I called again, nothing. Then I saw his mouth moving. He was speaking to someone. The mist in front of him was thick as wool, and there was no living soul within half a mile of that shore except myself and the sheep. But Angus was speaking, slowly, the way a man speaks when he is being answered. I started down the slope toward him. I was perhaps 80 yards away when he stepped forward into the loch. He did not stumble. He did not hesitate. He walked in the way a man walks toward his own front door after a long day. And the water took him to the knees, then the waist, then the chest, and then there was only the back of his head, and then there was nothing at all. The mist closed over the place where he had been. I ran. God help me, I ran the wrong way. I ran up the hill. 3 days later they found his crook lying in the reeds, the leather grip dark with damp. They never found Angus. I should tell you who I am, though my name will mean nothing to anyone who hears this. I was a shepherd. My father had been a shepherd, and his father before him, and we worked the high pastures above the loch for the Fraser farm, which sat in a fold of the hills about 2 miles north of the water. Donald Fraser was the master there. A hard man, sober and fair, with hands like split oak, and a way of looking at you that made lies wither in the mouth. He owned 600 head of black-faced sheep and 12 crofters' worth of grazing rights, and he kept the books in a leather ledger he never let out of his sight. The land we worked is difficult to describe to anyone who has not seen it. The hills rolled away in every direction in long gray humps, and the heather grew up over everything, so that in autumn the slopes turned the color of old blood. Granite came up out of the soil in great teeth where the wind had stripped the peat away. The wind never stopped. It came down off the higher peaks and ran along the floor of the glen, and made a low sound in the grass that you could hear inside your skull at night, even with the croft door shut and the hearth burning. The loch lay in the bottom of that glen like something fallen there. It was not a large body of water, perhaps 1.5 miles end to end and narrow, but it was deep. Old Donald said his grandfather had tried to sound it once with a fisherman's line and a lead weight, and the line had run out without finding bottom. The water was black in the middle and brown along the edges where the peat washed in, and on still days it gave back the sky so cleanly that a man could grow dizzy looking at it. We grazed sheep along the southern shore because the grass grew sweetest there. We had always grazed them there. Donald's father had done it, and his father, and nobody in living memory had stopped, although nobody in living memory had been easy about it either. There were warnings. There were always warnings in the Highlands. Don't whistle after dark. Don't cross running water with iron in your hand. Don't speak the names of certain things, and if you must speak them in Gaelic, and never in English, because the English tongue does not know how to be respectful to what came before it. Most of those warnings I had learned at my mother's knee, and then half forgotten, the way every man does, until I had cause to remember them. The men I worked alongside that autumn were Angus MC Loud, whom I have already named, and Ewan Ross, and a younger lad called Ian, whose surname I will not give, because his sister is still living. Angus was 44 years old, a widower, careful in his work and slow in his speech. Ewan was a different sort. He had been a soldier in his youth, and had served somewhere in India, and he came back from it without religion and without patience for what he called old wives' nonsense. Ewan would tell you to your face that the only things to fear in the hills were wolves and weather, and the wolves were gone. He drank, but not enough to spoil him for work. And there was old Morag, who was not one of us, but lived in a low stone croft at the head of the glen, and had lived there, by her own account, since before Donald Fraser's father had been a boy. Nobody truly knew how old Morag was. She kept 3 goats and a hive of bees and a memory longer than any church record. People went to her when something went wrong that the minister could not explain. The trouble began with the sheep. It was the 2nd week of September when we lost the first one. A 2-year-old ewe with a black mark on her left flank, gone in the night from a flock of 43 I had bedded down on the slope above the southern shore. There was no blood, there was no trail. The other sheep had not scattered the way sheep scatter when a dog or a fox has been among them. They had only stood quiet in their patch of bracken, and when I counted them in the morning, one was missing. I walked the slope twice before I went back to the farm. I found no scrap of wool on the heather, no torn earth, nothing. Donald listened to my account and made a small mark in his ledger and said nothing, which was his way. A week later we lost 2 more from a flock Ewan was watching down by the eastern point. Ewan swore at me and said I had miscounted, but Ewan had not miscounted, and he knew it. By the end of September we were down 9 head, and none of them ever seen again, alive or dead, in any form. It was around then that the sound started. I heard the first one on a clear night with no wind, sleeping in the bothy we kept on the high ground above the loch. A bothy is a small stone shelter, 4 walls and a roof, where a shepherd sleeps when the flock is too far from home to drive in. The one above the loch was old, the walls were thick. The door faced east, away from the water. I woke about an hour before dawn to a sound like a heavy thing breaking the surface of the water. Not a splash. A splash is sharp. This was a slow parting sound, the kind a man might make if he stood up from a bath. It came once. Then it came again. Then there was a silence so deep that I could hear my own blood moving in my ears. I did not get up. I lay there in the dark and listened, and after a long time I heard something else. A voice. It was too far away for me to make out words, and it was muffled by the stone walls, but it was a voice, and it was speaking in a low, even way. The way you might speak to a child who would not settle. In the morning I told Ewan. He laughed at me and said I had been dreaming. He said the loch had pike in it the size of a man's arm, and pike sometimes broke the surface at night, and as for voices, there was a sheep track along the far shore where drovers sometimes passed, and sound carried over water. The pike did not break the surface like that. The drovers did not come through in late September, and Ewan would not meet my eye when he said it. Ian's dog began to refuse the water around this time. Ian had a black collie called Bran, 4 years old, brave as any dog I have ever known. Bran would face down a stag at the rut and not blink. But that autumn, if Ian walked the dog within 50 paces of the shoreline, Bran would lower his belly to the ground and whine, and then he would turn and go back the way he had come, and no whistle or command would bring him back. Ian was ashamed of the dog. He should not have been. The dog was wiser than any of us. Sheep were going. By the 2nd week of October we had lost 15. We began to drive the flocks higher up the slopes, away from the water, and the losses slowed but did not stop. 2 more went from a pasture nearly a 1/4 mile from the shore, and there was no trail leading down. There was no trail at all. Then I found the tracks. I was walking the shore on a gray morning, looking for any sign at all of where our sheep had gone, when I came across them in a patch of soft mud where a small burn ran into the loch. Hoofprints, a line of them neat and unhurried, perhaps a dozen pairs, leading down the gentle slope of the bank. They walked straight toward the water. They did not waver. They did not bunch up the way a frightened flock will bunch. They walked in single file, as sheep walk when they are being led. The prints ended at the water's edge. There was no scuffle there, no turning, no trail coming back. The water was perhaps 2 feet deep at that point, and beyond it the bottom shelved away into the black, and the prints went into the water and stopped, as if the sheep had simply kept walking until the loch had swallowed them. I stood there for a long time. The wind had dropped. The surface of the loch was perfectly still. There were no birds. I went and fetched Donald. He came down to the shore himself, which was not his habit, and he stood looking at those tracks for a good while without speaking. He squatted and laid his hand flat against one of the prints. Then he stood up and looked out across the water, and I will tell you that I did not like what was in his face. "Don't graze the south shore," he said. "Drive everything to the north pastures by sundown." That was all he said. He walked back up the hill, and he did not look at the loch again. We moved the flocks. We worked into the dark to do it. By the time I came back to the bothy that night, I was bone-tired, and I slept like a man hit on the head, and in the morning Angus MC Loud was missing. He had been bedded down in the lower bothy, near the southern shore. His blankets were thrown back. His boots were gone. His crook was gone. The door of the bothy stood open. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned cup, no blood. He had simply got up in the night and walked out, and where he had gone I did not yet know. I would learn it 3 days later, when I saw him with his cap in his hand, speaking to the mist. Ian and I sat in old Morag's croft a week after I watched Angus walk into the water. I had not slept properly since. Ewan would not come with us. He said it was foolishness. I think now that he was afraid, and that he was the kind of man who answers fear with anger. Morag's croft smelled of peat smoke and dried herbs and something else, something sweet and old. She sat us by the fire and gave us tea without asking what we wanted, and when we had drunk some of it, she said, "You have come about the loch." I told her everything, the sheep, the tracks, the sounds in the night, Angus. She listened without interruption. When I had finished, she stared into the fire for a long while, and then she said a word I had not heard since I was a boy, and even then only in whispers. I knew the word and I did not know it. It belonged to that body of things my grandmother had spoken of when I was very small, things that lived in the lochs and the rivers and the wet places of the world. She had used the word the way another woman might use the word disease, as something real and dangerous and not to be discussed at length. Morag told us what she knew, and I will set it down here as best I can remember it. The Fuath, she said, was not one thing but a kind of thing, a spirit of the deep water, and there were many of them. And they had been in the lochs of Scotland since before the first man had built a hearth on these hills. They were not animals, they were not ghosts, they were something else older than either. They lived under the water and did not often come out, but when they did, they took the shape of a person more or less, pale as the belly of a fish, hair black and long and wet, eyes that did not blink, limbs too long, a voice that knew your name, though you had never told it. They did not chase. They did not need to. They called, and the called came willingly. She told us that her own grandmother had spoken of a fisherman lost from the eastern shore in 1804, found 3 weeks later miles downstream with his pockets full of stones and no mark on him. She told us of a child taken in 1822, whose mother had heard her singing from out on the water at night for a fortnight afterward, though no boat could find her. She told us of a drover in 1851 who had lost 12 cattle in a single night on the southern shore, and whose own brother had walked into the loch the following spring and had never come back. It feeds when it is hungry, she said. And it has been hungry a long while now. Ewan, when I told him later, called it old women's stories and said he would prove me a fool by walking the southern shore himself at dusk. He did. He came back white and silent and would not say what he had seen, and after that he did not laugh at me again, but he did not believe me either, and that is a different thing. I spent the next several days doing what I should perhaps have done earlier. I went to the parish church, which lay 6 miles west of the farm, and I asked the minister if I might look through the burial records. He was an old man named Cameron, and he had been the minister there for almost 40 years, and he knew me and my family, and he did not ask me why I wanted to see them. The records went back to 1742. I sat in the small vestry with the books open on the table and a candle by my elbow, and I read. I found 17 drownings in Loch Dearg between 1742 and 1887. 17 drownings in a loch where almost no one ever boated and into which no river of any size flowed. 12 of them had no witnesses. 9 of the bodies had never been recovered. 3 of the recovered bodies, the minister told me when I asked, had been described in the records of the time as showing no water in the lungs at all, which is to say, they had been dead before they had gone in. I copied down the dates and the names. When I came back to the farm and laid them out on the kitchen table at Donald Fraser's croft, and we placed each one on a rough map of the loch that I drew from memory, every single one of them had occurred along the same half-mile stretch of the southern shore. Every one. The same stretch where the hoofprints had ended. The same stretch where Angus had walked in. Donald looked at that map for a long time. Then he poured himself a measure of whiskey and drank it without speaking. "My father knew," he said at last. He never said it plain, but he knew. I asked him what his father had told him. "To not graze the south shore," Donald said. He told me when I was 8 years old, and I never asked him why, and I never grazed it. Not until I was a grown man with the farm to run, and I thought I had outgrown my father's caution. And so I let it be grazed. And so we are where we are." He put his head in his hands. "I went down to the loch alone on the evening of the 20th of October. I cannot tell you exactly why. I had a notion that if I saw it, plainly and with my own eyes, I would be able to act, and that if I did not see it, I would go on being a man who only half believed and who therefore could not act. I took my crook and my lantern and a length of rope and a knife in my belt. I did not take a dog. The dogs would not come. The light was failing by the time I reached the southern shore. The mist was beginning to rise. It rose from the water in slow ropes, the way smoke rises from a damp fire, and it gathered along the shoreline in a thick low band, perhaps 4 feet high. Above the mist, the sky was still pale. Below it, the world had gone the color of old iron. I walked along the bank slowly, watching the water. I saw it when I had gone perhaps 200 yards. It was standing in the shallows about 30 feet out, where the bottom shelved gently before it dropped away. The water came up past its knees. It was the shape of a person, more or less. The head was lowered. The hair hung down past the shoulders, very long, very black, and it was wet, and water dripped from it into the loch in a small steady patter that I could hear even from where I stood. The skin of the arms and the chest was the color of the underside of a mushroom. It was not moving. It was not breathing, so far as I could tell. It was just standing there in the water, with its head down. I did not move either. I could not. I felt the rope go cold in my hand, and I felt my own breath catch and stop in my throat, and somewhere far behind my mind there was a small, quiet voice saying that I should walk backward, slowly, and not turn my back on it. Then it raised its head. It did not turn toward me. It looked straight ahead, out across the water, away from me. But I saw the side of its face, and what I will say about it is this. It was not exactly the face of a person. The features were arranged in roughly the right places, but there was something wrong with the proportions, the way a face is wrong in a dream when you cannot quite see why. The eye that was visible to me did not blink. The mouth was slightly open. I took one step back, and I broke a small dry stick under my boot, and the sound was very small, but the figure heard it. It turned its head toward me, slowly, the way a thing turns its head when it has all the time in the world. I did not wait to see the front of its face. I turned and I ran, and I did not stop running until I was halfway up the hill. And when I looked back, the mist had filled the shore from end to end, and I could see nothing of the loch at all. When I reached the bothy, I bolted the door and sat with my back to it, and did not sleep for the rest of that night. The next week was the worst. I will try to tell it plainly. People began to hear voices, not just me. Mary Fraser, Donald's wife, who had never come near the loch in her life, woke her husband at 3 a.m, saying her dead brother was calling her name from outside the croft. There was no one outside the croft. Ian's mother, who lived in one of the lower crofts nearer the water, heard her sister's voice calling her down to the shore 3 nights running, although her sister had been dead for 11 years and was buried in Inverness. A boy who herded cattle for the next farm over walked 4 miles in his nightshirt before his father caught up with him on the road, and the boy could not say where he had been going, only that someone had been calling him. I had dreams. I dreamed I was standing on the shore of the loch in bright sunlight, and the water was clear all the way to the bottom, and the bottom was full of pale shapes lying on their backs, looking up at me. They had their eyes open. They did not move. In the dreams I knew their names. I knew Angus. I knew others I had only read in the church records. I would wake from those dreams and not be able to look at water for hours, not even the water in the bucket by the door. 3 of the men from the village went down to the shore in a body, in broad daylight, to see what could be seen. They came back in the afternoon and would not speak for the rest of the day, and one of them, a man called Kenneth, sat down by his own hearth and wept. Later, when his wife coaxed it out of him, he said they had seen people walking on the loch. 3 figures, he said, out in the middle, walking on the water as if it were a meadow. They had not been moving toward the shore. They had been walking away. The fog did not lift for 9 days. I had not seen the sun since the morning after I had stood on the shore. The mist gathered in every hollow of the land and would not leave it, and the air was still and cold and damp, and the wool on the sheep turned heavy with wet, and the dogs would not go out at night, and the children of the village began to wake screaming, and nobody in any of the houses slept well, and there was a feeling among us, all of us, that something was coming that we would not be able to stop. On the 9th night the storm broke. It came down off the western peaks just after dark, a true Highland storm, the kind that comes once or twice in a man's life and leaves him remembering it. The rain went sideways. The thunder rolled along the hills. The wind tore the thatch off 2 of the lower crofts and laid a stone wall flat in the upper pasture. The loch turned white with spray. We were a search party of 7, gathered in Donald Fraser's kitchen when the storm came on. We had agreed, all of us, that we would go down to the shore that night, together, with lanterns and ropes and whatever we could carry, and we would face whatever was there to be faced. I do not know exactly why we chose that night. I think we had reached the point where waiting was worse than going. We went out into the storm. There was Donald. There was Ewan white and grim and saying nothing. There was Ian. There was the minister Cameron, who had insisted on coming and who carried a small black Bible in his coat pocket. There was Kenneth, who had recovered enough to walk. There was a man called Robert Munro, who I have not yet named, a tenant on Donald's eastern fields. And there was myself. We went down to the southern shore in single file, with the wind at our backs, and the rain coming sideways into our faces, and the lanterns guttering in their glass. We saw it almost at once. The lightning showed it to us. A long fork of light broke open the sky above the loch and lit the whole valley as bright as noon for the space of a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat I saw the Fuath standing in the shallows not 40 feet from where we had stopped. It was tall. Taller than I had thought when I had seen it before, although then it had been bent over. Standing upright, it was perhaps 7 feet, with long, very long arms that hung past where a man's knees would be. The skin was pale and slick, the color of the inside of a shell. The hair was black and very long and hung straight down with the rain, and water ran off it in sheets. The face I saw for the first time fully then, in that flash of light, and I will tell you only that it had the shape of a human face, but had not been made by anything that knew or loved human beings. The eyes were dark, the mouth was open. The teeth were not the teeth of a man, and it was not alone. Behind it, further out, where the water was deeper, I saw shapes in the surface. Pale shapes, just under the water. Faces, I thought at first. Then I thought they were not faces but the tops of heads, looking up. The lightning went, and the dark came down again. Then the Fuath spoke. It used a voice that was Angus MC Loud's voice. I have not the words to tell you what it was like to hear my friend's voice come out of that mouth. It called Donald's name. Then it called Ian's name. Then it called my own name 3 times, gently, the way you call a child in from play. Kenneth made a small sound and took a step forward. Cameron the minister caught his arm and held him. Ian dropped his lantern. It went out in the wet grass. The voice changed. It was not Angus any more. It was Ian's father, who had been dead 5 years. It said Ian's name. It said it kindly. It said it the way a father says the name of his son when the son has done well. Ian pulled against the minister, and the minister could not hold him. Ian ran toward the water. He ran without a sound. I called after him, Donald shouted. Ian did not hear or did not heed. He ran straight in. I have seen many bad things in my life. I have not seen a worse one than that. The Fuath did not move. It only stood and waited, and Ian went into the water past his knees, past his waist, and then the long pale arms came down and took him, gently, almost tenderly, and lifted him a little, and the head bent down to his ear as if to whisper something. And then both of them were gone, and the water closed over the place where they had been with hardly a ripple. Cameron began to pray. I remember that. He prayed in a steady, level voice, not Latin, not Gaelic, but plain English, and he kept on praying as Donald grabbed me by the collar and dragged me backward up the slope, and the rest of us came after, stumbling, half blind in the rain. And from the loch behind us, I heard the voices begin to call. They called every name we had between us. They called names we had not given. We did not stop running until we reached the high ground above the bothy. The storm went on for another 2 hours. None of us spoke. We sat in the wet and the wind, and we waited for the dawn. And when the dawn came at last, it was gray and small and showed us a world that looked exactly the same as the one we had left, except that Ian was not in it, and never would be again. What followed has the dull shape of all things that follow a horror. The sheriff came up from Inverness 3 days later. He took our statements. He took them politely. He wrote in his book that Ian had drowned in the loch during a storm while attempting to recover lost livestock, and Angus MC Loud the same, and that other minor disappearances would be investigated as time permitted. He did not investigate them. There was nothing for him to find. The bodies were never recovered. The water did not give them back. Donald Fraser sold off the southern flocks the following spring and let the south shore go to wilderness. He did not graze it again. He did not speak of what we had seen. He grew old quickly after that autumn and died within 5 years, and his sons sold the farm and moved to the lowlands, and the crofts along the southern slope stood empty within a generation. Ewan Ross left for Canada in the spring of 1888 and never wrote to any one of us again. I cannot say I blame him. Kenneth took to drink and died of it before he was 50. Cameron the minister stayed in his parish until his health gave out, and he never spoke of that night to me again, although once, near the end of his life, he laid his hand on my arm and said, "I have prayed for those souls for 30 years. I do not know if it has done any good." That was all. Old Morag died in her own bed in the winter of 1892, of nothing in particular, the way very old people sometimes simply stop. And the loch is still there. It has not changed. The reeds grow where they always grew. The mist rises where it always rose. The southern shore is empty now, as it should always have been empty, and the sheep tracks that led down to the water have grown over with heather, and the bothy is a heap of stones. I am an old man now. I went back once last year, although I had sworn I would not. I do not know what drew me. Perhaps the same thing that draws all of us, in the end, toward the places we should not return to. I walked down the slope I had walked down 1,000 times as a young man, and I came to the southern shore in the late afternoon, and I stood where I had stood that evening 40 years ago, when I had seen Angus put his cap in his hand. The water was still. The mist was beginning to rise. I stood there a long while, and I did not see anything in the water, and I did not see anything on the water, and I thought perhaps the place had finally let me go. Then the mist came up around my knees, and from somewhere out across the loch, very faintly, I heard a voice. It said my name, just once. In a tone I knew well, although I had not heard it in 40 years. It was my own voice. I turned and walked back up the hill, and I did not look behind me. I have not been back since, and I will not go again. I have written this down so that someone may know. The minister told me once that all places have memory, and some places have more of it than others. I no longer wonder what lives beneath that loch. I wonder how many voices beneath the water were once human. And I wonder, on the bad nights, when I lie awake and listen to the wind that still finds its way down off the hills even here, so many miles from that valley, whether my own voice is being kept somewhere for the next man who comes walking along the southern shore in the failing light, with his cap in his hand, ready to listen. If you ever pass that loch, do not stop. Do not look at the water. And if you hear your name called from out across the mist, in any voice, in any tone, however dear it sounds to you, however much you have missed it, do not answer. Walk away. Walk up. Walk toward whatever light is left in the sky. Some places never forget. And some places, I think now, were never meant for us at all.